It has been 11 years, and they are still coming. I am recording this from a decommissioned relay station orbiting a dying star in the Paleth Reach, a stretch of space so empty that most navigational databases do not even bother naming it. I chose this place because nothing lives here, nothing grows, nothing passes through. I thought, perhaps foolishly, that the emptiness would protect me, that if I made myself small enough and quiet enough, the humans would lose interest. They have not lost interest. My name is Vorshan Kelix. I served for 23 years as a senior diplomatic attaché to the Galactic Concord Council, the governing body of 412 spacefaring civilizations. I held the rank of second consul. I attended state dinners with heads of government. I helped draft 14 interstellar trade agreements. I was, by any reasonable measure, a respected figure in galactic politics. And 11 years ago, I cast a vote that destroyed everything I had ever built, everything I had ever believed in, and everything I thought I understood about the universe. I voted to attack humanity. I want whoever finds this recording to understand something before I go any further. I was not a monster. I was not driven by hatred or cruelty. I was a bureaucrat. I looked at spreadsheets and trade projections and strategic forecasts, and I made what I believed was a rational decision based on the information available to me. That is the most terrifying part of this entire story. I was calm when I did it. I was reasonable. I weighed the costs and the benefits, and I concluded that a limited military strike against 3 human colony worlds was an acceptable course of action to protect Concord trade interests in the Varel Corridor. 42,000 people died because I thought it was acceptable. Let me take you back. 11 years ago, the Galactic Concord was the most powerful political body in known space. 412 member species, a combined military fleet of over 60,000 vessels, and economic control of nearly every major trade route between the galactic core and the outer arms. We were not a government in the traditional sense. We were a council of equals, though some were considerably more equal than others. The Drenhari hegemony, in particular, held enormous influence. They were the largest single military power in the Concord, with a fleet that dwarfed most other species combined. When the Drenhari spoke, the council listened. Humanity, by contrast, was barely a footnote. They had been spacefaring for less than 3 centuries. Their territory covered a modest stretch of 1 galactic arm, maybe 40 colonized worlds, with a fleet that our intelligence analysts described as competent but unremarkable. They had no voting seat on the council. They attended sessions as observers, participated in a few minor trade agreements, and were generally regarded as loud, disorganized, and commercially aggressive but strategically irrelevant. I remember thinking of them the way you might think of a small trading company that keeps undercutting your prices. Irritating, certainly. Dangerous, no. That was my first mistake. The problem began when human commercial interests started expanding into the Varel Corridor, a resource-rich stretch of neutral space that the Drenhari had long considered their exclusive economic territory. Human mining operations were faster, cheaper, and more efficient than their Drenhari counterparts. Within 2 years, human companies had captured nearly 30% of the corridor's rare mineral output. The Drenhari were furious. Their trade monopoly, which had stood unchallenged for over a century, was being eroded by a species they considered barely worth acknowledging. Hegemon Dralvast, the supreme political leader of the Drenhari, brought a formal proposal to the council. He called it a containment action. The language was deliberately clinical. 3 targeted strikes against human colony worlds in the corridor approaches. The stated objective was to demonstrate that expansion into Drenhari economic zones carried unacceptable risks. The unstated objective was to terrify humanity into retreat without triggering a full-scale war. It was meant to be a slap, hard enough to sting, not hard enough to provoke a real fight. I remember sitting in the council chamber and reading the proposal on my screen. 3 colonies. Estimated civilian presence, moderate. Projected casualties, minimal to moderate. Strategic outcome, high probability of human withdrawal from the corridor within 6 standard months. It read like a business plan, clean lines, clear projections, acceptable margins. I remember nodding as I read it. Then Ambassador Yiltari stood up. Yiltari was the Saswin Communion's representative to the council, a quiet, meticulous diplomat who rarely spoke during open sessions. She was small by galactic standards, barely reaching my shoulder, with iridescent scales that shifted color with her emotional state. That day, her scales were a deep, steady amber, a color I had learned to associate with controlled alarm. She had spent 4 standard years stationed on Earth as part of a cultural exchange program, one of only a handful of non-human diplomats to have lived among humans for an extended period. She asked for the floor, and the chamber fell silent. What she said next should have changed everything. It should have stopped us. I have replayed her words in my memory 10,000 times since that day, and each time, I feel the same sick weight of knowing that she was right, and that I did not listen. She said that humans do not process conflict the way other species do. She explained that every civilization the Council had ever dealt with followed a predictable pattern when faced with military aggression. They escalated to a point, assessed the cost of continued resistance, and then either fought a decisive engagement or negotiated a settlement. There was always a threshold, a moment when the rational calculation of losses versus gains produced a decision to stop. Every species had that threshold. Every species except one. Humans, Yiltari said, do not have a threshold. When they are harmed, something activates inside them that does not respond to cost-benefit analysis. She called it pursuit drive. She said that humans had a biological and cultural orientation towards sustained, long-term pursuit of those who had wronged them that had no equivalent in any other known species. She cited their own history. Wars that lasted 30 years. Feuds that lasted centuries. Criminal investigations that spanned entire lifetimes. Individuals who devoted every waking moment to hunting down a single person who had harmed them or their family, not for strategic advantage, not for resources, but because they believed, with every fiber of their being, that the person responsible must be held accountable. Not approximately, not symbolically, specifically and personally. She told us that if we struck those colonies, the humans would not negotiate, they would not accept reparations, they would not weigh the cost of retaliation against the benefits of peace. They would come after us, and they would not stop. Not in a year, not in a decade, not ever. The chamber was quiet for a moment after she finished. Then Hegemon Dralvast laughed. It was not a cruel laugh. It was the laugh of a powerful leader hearing something so absurd that genuine amusement was the only appropriate response. He said, with what I can only describe as absolute confidence, that no species in the history of the galaxy had ever sustained a military campaign against the Concord for longer than 8 standard months. He said that humanity's fleet was 1/15 the size of the Drenhari Armada alone. He said that the mathematics of power made Yiltari's concerns irrelevant. The vote was called, 7 in favor, 3 against. I voted in favor. I remember the exact motion of my hand pressing the confirmation key. I remember thinking that this was a measured, proportionate response to an economic challenge. I remember believing that it would be over quickly. The Drenhari assault fleet launched 9 days later. 3 battle groups, 40 warships each, converging on 3 targets simultaneously. The colonies were named Arden's Landing, Port Callan, and Meridian Shelf. I had never heard those names before the vote. I will never forget them now. The strikes were precise, exactly as the proposal had promised. Military installations were hit first, then infrastructure nodes, then communication arrays. The Drenhari commanders had been instructed to minimize civilian casualties, but the nature of orbital bombardment makes such instructions aspirational at best. When the dust settled and the damage reports came in, the combined death toll across all 3 colonies was 42,117 human beings. I received the confirmation report at my desk in the Concord Administrative Complex. I read the numbers. I noted that the casualty figures were within the projected range. I filed the report and moved on to the next item on my agenda. A trade dispute between 2 minor species over fishing rights in a shared ocean world. That is how little the deaths meant to me at the time. They were a line item. They were a cost of doing business. They were, in the word I used during a private briefing with my staff, manageable. For the next 6 weeks, I waited for the human response. I expected a furious diplomatic protest. I expected emergency sessions at neutral arbitration bodies. I expected demands for reparations. Threats of economic sanctions, perhaps even a symbolic military gesture, a fleet mobilization, or a border incursion designed to demonstrate resolve before the inevitable negotiations began. None of that happened. Humanity said nothing. Their ambassador to the Concord did not request an emergency session. Their military fleet did not mobilize. Their government issued no public statement. Their news networks, which we monitored constantly, carried extensive coverage of the attacks. But the political response was silence. Complete, absolute, unbroken silence. I told myself that they were in shock, that the scale of the strikes had overwhelmed their capacity to respond, that they were a young species, unaccustomed to the realities of interstellar power politics, and that they needed time to process what had happened before they could formulate a coherent response. I was wrong about all of it. The silence was not confusion. The silence was not grief. The silence was not the paralysis of a species that did not know what to do. The silence was planning. I know that now. I have known it for 11 years. And every day, in this empty station orbiting this dying star, I understand it a little more deeply. While I was filing trade reports and attending cocktail receptions and sleeping soundly in my quarters, 42,000 families were being contacted, 42,000 names were being compiled, 42,000 stories were being recorded, and somewhere in the depths of human space, in rooms I will never see, people I will never meet were sitting down together and making a very simple decision. Not a decision about whether to respond. That was never in question. The decision was about how long they were willing to wait. The answer, as it turned out, was forever. I did not understand that then. I understand it now. And I am putting it in this recording because I need someone, somewhere, at some point in the future, to hear these words, and take them seriously, in a way that I did not take Yiltari's words seriously 11 years ago. If you are listening to this, and you are considering any action against humanity, I need you to hear me. Not as a diplomat, not as a political figure, as a frightened old man sitting alone in the dark at the edge of mapped space, recording his testimony because he has nothing left. Do not do it. Whatever the reason, whatever the justification, whatever the strategic calculation, do not do it, because they will come for you, and they will never, ever stop. 49 days after the strikes, the first human response arrived, and it was nothing like what any of us had expected. There was no fleet, no warships, no missiles streaking through the void toward our stations. Instead, a single unarmed freighter dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Concorde's outer relay network, a chain of communication stations that carried diplomatic and commercial traffic across civilized space. The freighter was a standard commercial hauler, the kind that carried grain and machine parts between colony worlds. It had no weapons. It had no military escort. It had no markings of any kind, except a registration number and a name painted on its hull in white letters. The ship was called the Remembrance. The Remembrance powered up its communication array and broadcast a single transmission on every frequency simultaneously. Every diplomatic channel, every military command frequency, every civilian news network, every emergency band. The signal was so powerful and so broadly targeted that it reached over 300 inhabited systems within the first hour. And the message it carried was not a declaration of war. It was a list. 42,117 names. Every single person who had died in the colony strikes. Not just names either. Each entry included a photograph, a date of birth, and one sentence describing who that person was. A teacher. A pilot. A child who had just learned to walk. A grandmother who had survived the colonization of Ardennes Landing and helped build its first permanent settlement with her own hands. An engineer who had designed the water purification system for Port Callan. A musician who had played in the town square of Meridian Shelf every evening at sunset. The broadcast lasted 9 hours. 9 hours of names and faces and single-sentence lives, scrolling across every screen in the civilized galaxy. And when it was done, the Remembrance powered down its array, engaged its drive, and left. No demands, no ultimatum, no return address. I watched the broadcast from my office. I did not watch all 9 hours, but I watched enough. I remember the face of a little girl named Sophie Ashworth, 4 years old, who had been listed simply as a child who loved drawing pictures of starships. I remember a man named George Pennington, 67, described as a retired dock worker who taught his neighbors how to grow tomatoes in alien soil. I remember a young woman named Charlotte Voss, 23, a medical student who had volunteered at a free clinic on Meridian Shelf, and who had, according to the single sentence beside her photograph, saved 11 lives during the first wave of bombardment before the second wave took hers. I closed my screen after Charlotte Voss. I sat in my office and stared at the wall, and for the first time since the vote, I felt something other than bureaucratic satisfaction. I did not yet feel guilt. That came later. What I felt was unease, a cold, formless sensation that something had shifted in a way I could not yet identify. The council's reaction was confused. An emergency session was convened, and for 3 hours, the assembled representatives debated the meaning of the broadcast. Some interpreted it as a mourning ritual, a public expression of grief common to many species. Others called it psychological warfare, an attempt to generate sympathy among neutral species and isolate the concord diplomatically. Hegemon Dralavas dismissed it with a wave of his massive hand and said the words that I have never been able to forget. He said they sent names, not ships. 2 weeks later, the Drenhari learned what the names were for. The Drenhari hegemony's largest orbital shipyard hung in a stable orbit above their industrial moon Corveth. It was a massive installation, nearly 4 kilometers long, capable of constructing and maintaining warships of every class. 14,000 Drenhari workers lived and worked aboard the station. It was the beating heart of Drenhari military production, and it was considered one of the most secure installations in the galaxy, protected by defensive platforms, patrol squadrons, and multiple layers of electronic countermeasures. On the morning of the 63rd day after the colony strikes, every system aboard the Corveth shipyard stopped functioning simultaneously. Power generation went offline, life support switched to emergency reserves, communication arrays went dark, navigation systems locked, defensive platforms froze in their positions. 14,000 workers woke up in a station that had become, in the space of a single heartbeat, a dead hulk drifting in orbit around an industrial moon. The Drenhari dispatched rescue ships immediately, and when the first teams boarded the station, they found something that sent a tremor through the entire hegemony's military command. The station had not been damaged, nothing was broken, nothing was burned. The entire software architecture of the installation, every line of code that controlled every system from the reactor core to the door locks, had been rewritten from the inside. Not destroyed, replaced. Every system was now running on human code, and every screen on the station, from the command center displays to the personal tablets in crew quarters, showed the same thing: a name, a single name from the list, a different name every hour. When the Drenhari technical teams managed to purge the human code and restore the station's original systems, the process took 11 days. During those 11 days, 14,000 workers had to be evacuated, the station's entire defensive network was offline, and 3 warships under construction were delayed by months. The economic damage was staggering. The military disruption was severe, but the real damage was psychological. The most secure military installation in the Drenhari hegemony had been penetrated, reprogrammed, and effectively seized without a single shot being fired, and the humans had used it to display the names of the dead. That was the beginning. Over the next several months, the pattern repeated across Drenhari space and beyond. A communications relay hub in the Thresar system went dark for 6 days. When it came back online, every automated message it sent for the next week ended with a name from the list. A financial processing center that handled trade transactions for the entire Drenhari Eastern sector experienced a cascading software failure that froze billions of credits in transit. When the system was restored, the transaction logs showed that every frozen payment had been rerouted through a ghost account, labeled with the name of a dead colonist. A supply depot that served as the primary logistics node for 3 Drenhari fleet groups found its entire inventory database corrupted. Every item in storage, every fuel cell, every replacement part, every ration pack was relabeled in the system with the name, age, and occupation of a person who had died on Ardennes landing. The humans were not attacking military targets. They were attacking infrastructure, trade hubs, communication relays, financial systems, supply chains, and every single attack was tagged with names from the list. The message was unmistakable. You killed 42,000 people, and we are going to make sure you remember every single one of them. I began to understand, during those early months, that the humans were not waging a war. War has objectives: territory to capture, resources to seize, governments to topple. The humans did not want any of those things. What they were conducting was something far more disturbing, something that had no equivalent in the strategic doctrines of any species I had ever studied. They were collecting a debt, and they were counting it name by name. The council fractured almost immediately. 3 member species, the Villani Republic, the Saswin Communion, and the Orarathi Federation, demanded that the Drenhari open negotiations with humanity and offer full reparations. The Drenhari refused. Hegemon Dralvas declared that his people's military doctrine did not permit concessions to an inferior species. He ordered a full military mobilization and vowed to crush what he called the human nuisance campaign within 1 standard month. Ambassador Yiltari did not say "I told you so." She did something worse. She stood in the council chamber, her scales a deep, steady blue that I had never seen before, and formally withdrew the Saswin Communion from the Galactic Concord. Her statement was 4 words long. She said, "I warned you," and she walked out. 3 other species followed her within the week. It was during this period that I learned something that frightened me more than anything the humans had done to the Corveth shipyard, or the financial processing centers, or the supply depots. I learned where the human intelligence was coming from. Our counterintelligence services had been working frantically to identify the human operatives responsible for the infrastructure attacks. What they discovered was not a spy network. It was not a team of elite saboteurs who had infiltrated Drenhari space under false identities. The humans who were feeding information to Earth were ordinary people. Freight handlers, technical contractors, language tutors, dock workers, cooks, maintenance technicians. Hundreds of humans who had been living and working in Concord space for years, sometimes decades, holding perfectly ordinary jobs and living perfectly ordinary lives. They had not been planted, they had not been recruited, they had not been trained in espionage or given secret missions. They were simply humans who lived among us, and when the list of 42,000 names was broadcast across every frequency in civilized space, they made a choice. They chose to help. They began sharing information, schedules, access codes, system vulnerabilities, shipping routes, personnel movements. Not because they were ordered to, but because those were their people. Those 42,000 names belonged to their civilization, and the broadcast was not just a memorial, it was a call, and every human in the galaxy heard it. The Drenhari had not been infiltrated by spies. They had been surrounded by neighbors who had simply decided, all at once, that neighborliness was over. I began having trouble sleeping. I told myself it was the stress of the political situation, the council fracturing, the Drenhari mobilizing, the uncertainty of what the humans would do next. But the truth was simpler than that. I was afraid, not of an attack, not of a fleet bearing down on my world. I was afraid of the patience. Every other threat I had ever faced in my career had been loud. Angry species made demands. Hostile governments issued ultimatums. Military powers positioned fleets and dared you to flinch. The humans did none of those things. They just kept going. Quietly, methodically, name by name by name. The Drenhari admiral who had commanded the strike fleet, a decorated officer named Vorketh, held a public address 6 months after the attacks began. He stood on a stage in full ceremonial armor and declared that the human campaign of disruption would be ended within 30 standard days. He outlined a military operation involving 200 warships that would locate and destroy the human staging bases responsible for the infrastructure attacks. He spoke with the absolute confidence of a man who commanded the most powerful fleet in the galaxy and who had never once questioned whether that power made him untouchable. I am recording this testimony 11 years later. Admiral Vorketh was the 17th senior Drenhari official to disappear. He was never found. Not his body, not his ship, not a single trace of his existence after the day he stepped off that stage. He simply ceased to be, as if the universe had quietly erased him while no one was looking. I did not know, at the time, that the disappearances would become a pattern. I did not know that the humans were just getting started. I did not know that the slow, patient, methodical campaign that had begun with names on screens would eventually consume the Drenhari hegemony, dissolve the galactic concord, and reshape the political map of the entire galaxy. But I was beginning to suspect, and late at night, alone in my quarters, I would sometimes pull up the broadcast recording and watch the names scroll by, and I would think about the word I had used to describe 42,000 deaths. Manageable. I do not use that word anymore. 14 months after the colony strikes, the nature of the human campaign changed. For the first year, they had focused almost exclusively on the Drenhari. Their targets had been Drenhari infrastructure, Drenhari systems, Drenhari installations. The rest of the council had watched from a cautious distance, some with concern, some with barely concealed satisfaction, at seeing the Drenhari's arrogance punished. There was a quiet, unspoken consensus among the non-Drenhari council members that this was a bilateral problem. The Drenhari had ordered the strikes. The humans were retaliating against the Drenhari. The rest of us were bystanders. That consensus died on a Tuesday. I remember the day precisely because I was attending a routine budgetary session when my personal communicator began vibrating with emergency notifications. The humans had released a data package, not through a broadcast this time, but through a carefully coordinated distribution network that delivered the files simultaneously to every major news organization, independent journalist, and public information archive in the galaxy. The package contained the complete internal record of the Council's decision to authorize the colony strikes. Not a summary, not a redacted version, the complete record. Every formal session transcript, every private deliberation, every backroom communication between council members, every message, every note, every casual aside exchanged in the corridors outside the council chamber. Everything. I read through the files with a growing sense of horror that had nothing to do with military strategy or political calculation. The horror was personal, because I was in those files. My words were in those files. Every dismissive comment I had made about the human colonies, every casual reference to acceptable casualty projections, every time I had described the planned strikes as a proportionate response, or a containment action, or a manageable intervention, every word I had spoken in private, believing that those conversations would never leave the room, was now available for every living being in the galaxy to read. I found the specific passage that destroyed my career. It was from a private briefing I had given to my staff 3 days before the vote. I had been summarizing the strategic rationale for the strikes, and I had said, in a tone that I can only describe as bored, that the projected civilian casualties were within acceptable parameters, and that the political fallout would be minimal, because humanity lacked the institutional standing to generate meaningful diplomatic pressure. I had then made a joke. I do not remember the exact words, but it was something about humans being too busy arguing among themselves to organize a coherent response. That joke was broadcast across 400 star systems. I became, overnight, the face of council indifference. News networks ran the clip on a loop. Editorial commentators dissected my words syllable by syllable. Protest movements on neutral worlds used my photograph on their banners. 3 council members who had voted in favor of the strikes resigned within 48 hours of the release. 2 others fled to neutral territories, claiming diplomatic immunity that no one was interested in honoring. My government recalled me from the council and issued a public statement distancing itself from my actions. I was not the only one exposed. Every council member who had voted for the strikes was laid bare in those files. Their motivations, their calculations, their private conversations. The Orathi representative had voted in favor because the Drenhari had promised him preferential trade access. The Thrasari delegate had supported the strikes because she believed it would prevent a larger conflict later. The Kelvani ambassador had voted yes simply because he was afraid of what the Drenhari would do to his people if he voted no. Every reason, every justification, every moment of moral compromise was now public record. But the humans were not content with exposing the council. They had a military opponent to deal with, and the Drenhari had given them an opportunity. Hegemon Dralvast, stung by the months of infrastructure attacks and humiliated by the intelligence leaks, had ordered the Drenhari main battle fleet to engage human forces directly. He assembled 400 warships, the largest fleet action in Concord history, and dispatched them to the Varel Corridor, where human forward staging areas had been identified by Drenhari intelligence. The fleet was commanded by Admiral Thenar Korax, a veteran officer with 40 years of combat experience, and a reputation for methodical, relentless prosecution of military objectives. He was considered the finest tactical mind in the hegemony. The fleet arrived at the Varel Corridor 17 days after departing Drenhari space. They dropped out of faster-than-light travel in perfect formation. 400 warships, arranged in a battle configuration that had crushed every opponent the Drenhari had ever faced. Their weapons were charged. Their shields were raised. Their targeting systems were locked. The corridor was empty. Not empty in the sense that the humans had retreated or dispersed. Empty in the sense that there was nothing there. No staging areas, no supply depots, no communications equipment, no debris field suggesting a hasty withdrawal. The humans had never been there. The intelligence that had placed them in the corridor had been fabricated, fed to Drenhari analysts through channels that the humans had been manipulating for months. While Admiral Korax was processing this realization, his communications officer informed him of incoming reports from Drenhari space. In the 17 days that the main fleet had been in transit, human strike groups had simultaneously attacked 11 supply depots across the Drenhari logistical network. These were not the software infiltrations of the previous year. These were physical strikes, fast, precise, and devastating. The depots were destroyed, not damaged. Not disabled, reduced to expanding clouds of debris. The main fleet had fuel and supplies for approximately 60 days of independent operations. Without the supply depots, there was no way to replenish. 400 warships, the pride of the Drenhari hegemony, were stranded in an empty corridor with a ticking clock. Admiral Korax ordered an immediate return to Drenhari space. The fleet arrived to find its supply lines gone, its logistics network in chaos, and its political leadership in a state of barely controlled panic. The largest military operation in Concord history had accomplished nothing. The humans had not even bothered to fight. They had simply moved and let the Drenhari exhaust themselves chasing phantoms. It was during the aftermath of the Varel Corridor debacle that I began to truly understand what the humans were doing, and this understanding is the reason I am making this recording. Because the lesson I learned is the most important thing I have ever understood about any species, and it is the thing that every civilization in this galaxy must hear. Humans do not fight battles. They fight campaigns. The distinction seems small, but it is the difference between a thunderstorm and a glacier. A battle is an event. Two forces meet, they exchange fire, one prevails, and both sides go home to assess the outcome. A battle has a beginning, a middle, and an end. Every species I had ever studied fought battles. The Drenhari were exceptional at battles. Their fleet tactics were the finest in the galaxy. Their admirals were brilliant practitioners of the art of concentrated force, applied at decisive points. None of that mattered, because the humans were not fighting battles. They were fighting a campaign, and a campaign is not an event. A campaign is a condition. It does not end when the shooting stops. It does not end when the fleet goes home. It does not end when one side is tired, or when the costs become too high, or when a better opportunity presents itself. A campaign ends when the objective is achieved, and not one moment before. The human objective was not territory. They did not claim a single square meter of Drenhari space. It was not resources. They did not seize a single mine or factory or fuel depot. It was not political concessions. They did not demand a change in government or a revision of council voting procedures. Their objective was accountability. Specific, personal, individual accountability for every single being who had authorized, planned, or executed the attack on their colonies. Not symbolic accountability, not a formal apology from a government spokesperson, not a monument or a day of remembrance or a diplomatic resolution expressing regret. The humans wanted every individual who had played a role in the deaths of 42,000 people to personally answer for what they had done. Every admiral who had given an order, every politician who had cast a vote, every analyst who had prepared the targeting data, every pilot who had pressed the firing control. And they would not stop until every single one had answered. I discovered, during this period, that my own name had appeared on a human tracking list. Not as a military target. The humans were careful about that distinction. I was listed as a political figure, complicit in the authorization of the strikes. The designation carried no threat of violence. It carried something worse. It carried attention. Somewhere in the depths of human intelligence, an analyst had a file with my name on it. That file contained my photograph, my service record, my known associates, my travel patterns, my communication habits, and my current location. The file was updated regularly. No one contacted me. No threat was made. No demand was issued. I simply knew, because the leaked intelligence files made it clear, that I was being watched. The humans knew where I was. They knew what I was doing, and they were waiting. I cannot adequately describe what that knowledge does to a person over time. It is not like being hunted. Being hunted implies pursuit, movement, the possibility of escape. This was different. This was the knowledge that somewhere, someone was sitting in a room with your name on a screen, and they were not in a hurry. They had nowhere else to be. They had nothing more important to do. They were simply maintaining awareness of your existence, the way you might keep track of a package you had ordered that had not yet arrived. You do not run from a package delivery. You cannot fight a package delivery. You simply wait, knowing that eventually, inevitably, it will come. The Drenhari began to break, not all at once, not in a dramatic collapse. The hegemony fractured the way a frozen lake fractures, slowly at first, with hairline cracks spreading across the surface, and then all at once, in a cascading failure that left nothing solid to stand on. Individual Drenhari commanders began surrendering, not to human forces, but to neutral species. They requested asylum, political protection, anything that would get them out of the path of the human campaign. Military leaders blamed civilian politicians for authorizing the strikes. Civilian politicians blamed military leaders for exceeding their mandate. Intelligence officers blamed analysts for failing to predict the human response. Analysts blamed intelligence officers for providing insufficient data about human behavioral patterns. Everyone was pointing at someone else, and the humans watched them do it with the patience of geologists watching a mountain erode. 3 years after the strikes, Hegemon Dralvast, the most powerful political figure in the Drenhari hegemony, the man who had laughed when Yil-Altari warned the council, sent a private, encrypted message to the human government requesting terms for a cessation of hostilities. The message was formal, carefully worded, and, for the first time in Drenhari political history, explicitly acknowledged wrongdoing. The hegemon expressed willingness to pay full reparations to the families of the dead, to submit to an independent investigation, and to accept whatever sanctions the human government deemed appropriate. The human response arrived within 6 hours. It was 1 sentence long. "We have not finished yet." Dralvast read that sentence and, according to sources who were present, did not speak for the rest of the day. I think he understood, in that moment, what Yiltare had tried to tell the council 3 years earlier. He was not dealing with an enemy who wanted to win. He was dealing with an enemy who wanted to be thorough. And thorough, in human terms, meant something that no other species in the galaxy had ever had to face. It meant they would keep going until they were done, not until you wanted them to stop, not until the cost became too great, not until the political situation changed or the leadership turned over or a more pressing threat emerged, until they were done, and only they got to decide when that was. I left the conquered capital that night. I packed a single bag, boarded a commercial transport under a false identity, and began running. I did not know where I was going. I only knew that I could not stay still. The years between 4 and 8 were the ones that taught the rest of the galaxy what the Drenhari had already learned. The humans were not satisfied with punishing the species that had pulled the trigger. They intended to pursue every thread of complicity, every connection, every act of support that had made the colony strikes possible. 3 council member species had provided material support for the Drenhari strike fleet. The Orathi Federation had supplied fuel. The Kelvani Directorate had provided navigational data for the approach routes. The Thrasari Union had granted staging rights. allowing Drenhari warships to use their border stations as forward bases. Each of these contributions had been essential to the execution of the strikes. Without fuel, the fleet could not have reached the colonies. Without navigational data, they could not have plotted the precise approach vectors needed for simultaneous strikes on 3 targets. Without staging rights, they could not have assembled the attack force in a forward position without alerting human early warning systems. The humans did not come for these species with warships. That was never their method. Instead, they applied the same patient, systematic pressure that had broken the Drenhari, adapted to the specific vulnerabilities of each target. The Orathi Federation's economy depended on a complex web of trade agreements with dozens of species. Human commercial interests had been growing in the same markets for years, and they now leveraged those relationships. Trade partners were quietly informed that continued commercial engagement with the Orathi would be noted, not threatened, noted. The implications were left unspoken, and that was precisely what made them effective. Within 6 months, the Orathi found that their trade volume had dropped by 40%. Not because anyone had imposed sanctions, because individual businesses and governments across the galaxy had independently decided that being associated with the Orathi was a risk they did not want to take. The Kelvani Directorate's vulnerability was different. Their government was an oligarchy, held together by a fragile balance of power among 7 ruling families. The humans did not need to destabilize that balance. They simply needed to make it clear that the balance could be destabilized, and the 7 families did the rest. Within a year, 2 families had publicly broken with the others over the question of cooperation with the Human Tribunal, and the Directorate's political structure was paralyzed by internal conflict. The Thrasari Union was the fastest to capitulate. Their staging rights had been the smallest contribution, and their government had always been uneasy about the decision. When human diplomatic representatives arrived with evidence of the staging agreement, evidence that the Thrasari had believed was classified beyond any possibility of exposure, the Union's leadership calculated the trajectory of resistance and chose not to follow the Drenhari down that path. One by one, each of these species came to the table. The human terms were consistent across all 3. Full public acknowledgement of complicity, financial reparations to the families of the dead, surrender of specific officials who had authorized the support. Not political figures in general, specific individuals, named and identified, whose decisions had directly enabled the strikes. It was the specificity that defined the human approach. They did not want symbolic gestures, they did not want institutional responsibility. They wanted the person who signed the fuel authorization order. They wanted the analyst who compiled the navigational data. They wanted the station commander who opened the docking bays for the Drenhari warships. Individual people who had made individual decisions that had contributed to the deaths of 42,000 human beings. During this period, I was running. I moved 7 times in 4 years, crossing from conquered space into neutral territories, and then into the ungoverned reaches beyond the mapped borders of galactic civilization. Each time I settled in a new location, I chose carefully. Remote stations, minor colonies, places with minimal communication infrastructure and no strategic significance, places where no one would look for a disgraced former diplomat. And each time, within months, something would happen that made me move again. The first time, it was a human trade vessel docking at the station where I was living under a false name. Not a military ship, not an intelligence vessel, a perfectly ordinary commercial freighter carrying agricultural supplies. It docked, conducted its business, and left. No one aboard showed any interest in me, but the fact that a human ship had come to a station so remote that it averaged fewer than 10 visitors per standard year was enough to send me packing. The second time, I had settled on a small colony world in Villani space. 3 months after my arrival, a news bulletin appeared on the local network, reporting that a human diplomatic office had opened on a neighboring world, the first human presence in that sector. I left that same day. The third time, I was living in a mining outpost on an asteroid in unclaimed space. I had been there for 5 months and had begun to relax. Then I noticed a human language advertisement on the outpost's commercial network. It was an ad for a shipping company, completely mundane, completely innocent. But the outpost's network had never carried human language content before. I stared at that advertisement for a long time, and then I packed my bag. I could never prove that any of these things were connected to me. The trade vessel might have been a coincidence. The diplomatic office might have been a routine expansion of human commercial interests. The advertisement might have been a standard marketing campaign. But the pattern was too consistent to dismiss. Everywhere I went, human presence followed. Not aggressively, not threateningly, just present. A reminder that the galaxy was not as large as I wanted it to be. It was during the 6th year that the humans established the tribunal, and this was perhaps the most brilliant and most terrifying thing they did throughout the entire campaign. They did not create a human court. A human court would have been dismissed by the galactic community as victor's justice, a farce dressed in legal robes. Instead, the humans proposed an independent, multi-species judicial body, staffed entirely by neutral species with no connection to the strikes or their aftermath. They offered to provide all evidence, all testimony, and all logistical support, but the judges, the prosecutors, and the legal framework would be drawn from civilizations that had no stake in the outcome. 17 species volunteered. The tribunal was established on a neutral station in the Paleth Reach, and its proceedings were broadcast galaxy-wide. I watched from whatever hiding place I was occupying at the time as the first cases were heard. Former Drenhari military commanders, Concord intelligence analysts, logistics officers, communications technicians, each one brought before the tribunal, confronted with evidence of their specific contribution to the colony strikes, and required to answer for their individual actions. The evidence was overwhelming. The humans had been collecting it for years, quietly, patiently, methodically. Communication intercepts, operational orders, system logs, testimony from witnesses, surveillance data. They had reconstructed the entire chain of command that had produced the strikes, from Hegemon Dralvast at the top to the individual weapons operators who had pressed the firing controls at the bottom. Every link in the chain was documented. Every decision was recorded. Every person was identified. The proceedings were calm. That was what struck me most. The human representatives who presented evidence to the tribunal did not shout. They did not weep. They did not make emotional appeals or dramatic gestures. They presented facts. They laid out timelines. They connected decisions to consequences with the precision of engineers tracing a circuit diagram. They were not angry. They were thorough. And then came the moment that I believe marked the true turning point of the entire campaign. Hegemon Dralvast, the man who had laughed at Yiltari's warning, the most powerful political figure in the Drenhari hegemony, was found by human operatives on a remote colony world where he had been living under a false identity for 2 years. He had fled Drenhari space when the hegemony began to fracture, taking a small entourage of loyal guards and establishing himself in a quiet settlement on a world so obscure that it did not appear on most standard navigational charts. He had changed his name. He had altered his appearance. He had severed all connections to his former life. For 2 years, he had lived as a retired merchant, spending his days in unremarkable routine, believing that he had successfully disappeared. The human officer who found him was a woman named Eleanor Marsh. She was not a soldier. She was not an intelligence operative in any traditional sense. She was a civilian investigator attached to the tribunal, a former police detective from a human colony world who had spent her entire career tracking people who did not want to be found. She had been assigned the Dralvast file 4 years earlier and had spent every day since then following the trail. She did not arrest him. She had no authority to arrest anyone. She did not threaten him. She did not bring weapons or guards or a fleet of warships to intimidate him into compliance. She walked into the public dining hall, where Dralvast ate his midday meal every day, sat down across from him at his table, and placed a single document in front of him. It was a tribunal summons bearing his real name. Dralvast looked at the document for a long time. Then he looked at Eleanor Marsh, and he asked her a question that I think will be quoted in diplomatic textbooks for the next 1,000 years. He said, "How did you find me?" And she said, "We never stopped looking." According to witnesses, Dralvast sat in silence for several minutes after that. Then he picked up the summons, folded it carefully, and placed it in his pocket. He asked Eleanor Marsh if he could finish his meal first. she said of course. They sat together in silence while he ate, and when he was done, he stood up and walked with her to the transport that would take him to the tribunal. I learned about this event from a news broadcast, and I remember the exact moment when the full weight of it landed on me. The most powerful man in the Drenhari hegemony, a leader who had commanded fleets and ruled over billions, had been found by a single human detective who had simply refused to stop looking, not because she was ordered to, not because there was a deadline or a quota or a performance review, because 42,000 people had died, and one of the people responsible had not yet answered for it, and that was unacceptable to her in a way that went beyond duty or profession or even personal conviction. It was cellular, it was foundational, it was built into the architecture of what she was. The broader galaxy watched Vast's capture, and the lesson was not subtle. You cannot hide from humans, not because they are omniscient, not because they have superior technology or unlimited resources. You cannot hide because they will not stop looking, ever. The search is not a phase. It is not a campaign that will be defunded when the political winds change. It is a permanent condition, maintained by individuals who consider the pursuit itself to be a moral obligation, independent of any institutional framework. Do not provoke Earth. That became the unspoken first principle of galactic politics during the Middle Years. Not because anyone issued a decree, not because the humans demanded it, because every species in the galaxy watched what happened to those who crossed humanity, and each independently arrived at the same conclusion. Friendship was preferable to the alternative. Trade agreements flowed toward Earth. Cultural exchange programs expanded. Military cooperation treaties were signed, not because the humans wielded their power coercively, but because the galaxy had learned, through the extended, methodical, patient object lesson of the Drenhari campaign, that humans treated their relationships with the same seriousness that they treated their grievances. A human ally would remember your friendship the same way a human enemy would remember your betrayal. The only difference was which side of that memory you wanted to be on. During the 8th year, I received a message. It arrived on an encrypted channel that I had believed was secure, using a protocol that I had purchased from a black market communications dealer who assured me it was untraceable. The message was from the tribunal. It was not a summons, it was not a threat, it was an invitation to testify voluntarily. The language was formal but not cold. It explained that my role in the authorization of the colony strikes had been documented, and that the tribunal believed my testimony would contribute to a complete accounting of the events that led to the deaths of 42,000 people. It stated that if I chose to testify voluntarily, the tribunal would take my cooperation into consideration during its proceedings. It stated that if I chose not to testify, no coercive action would be taken against me. The final line of the message said simply that the invitation remained open indefinitely. I read it 7 times. Then I closed it and did not respond. I told myself I needed time to think. I told myself the situation was complicated. I told myself 100 things that were all different ways of saying the same thing, which was that I was afraid. 3 years later, I am still here. The invitation is still in my message queue, unanswered, and I am recording this testimony instead, telling myself it is for posterity. It has been 11 years since the colony strikes. The Drenhari hegemony no longer exists. It fractured into 7 successor states, 4 of which have formal diplomatic relations with Earth. 2 of the successor states were actually established with human assistance, their new governments built on frameworks that included specific provisions for civilian protection and governmental accountability that were drafted by human legal scholars. The Galactic Concord Council has been dissolved. The institution that governed 412 species for over 2 centuries was formally disbanded in the 7th year after the strikes, replaced by a new body called the Assembly of Civilizations. Humanity holds a permanent seat. No action can be authorized by the Assembly without a human review of potential civilian impact. This provision was not demanded by the humans. It was proposed by the other member species, who wanted to ensure that no future assembly could ever repeat what the Concord had done. Of the original officials directly involved in the authorization and execution of the colony strikes, all but 3 have been brought before the tribunal. The outcomes have varied. Some were found guilty and sentenced to terms of confinement. Others were found to have acted under duress or without full knowledge of the consequences and received lesser penalties. 2 were acquitted entirely. The humans did not protest the acquittals. They accepted the tribunal's judgments in every case, because the objective was never punishment, it was accountability. The process itself, the act of standing before a judicial body and answering for your specific individual actions, was the point. 2 of the remaining officials were surrendered by their own governments, species that had initially sheltered them, but eventually concluded that the cost of continued defiance outweighed the cost of cooperation. One turned himself in after 9 years of running. He said, in a public statement before the tribunal, that he had grown tired of living as a ghost and that the weight of what he had done was heavier than any sentence the tribunal could impose. One died of natural causes in the 10th year. He was an elderly Kelvani analyst who had compiled the navigational data used by the Drenhari strike fleet. When news of his death reached the tribunal, the human delegation formally closed his file and issued a statement acknowledging that natural death had rendered tribunal proceedings moot. Then 3 human representatives traveled to the Kelvani world where he had died and attended his memorial service. They brought 42 flowers, 1 for each 1,000 colonists who had died using the approach routes he had calculated. They placed the flowers at his memorial without speaking, stood in silence for several minutes, and then left. The Kelvani who witnessed this said it was the most unsettling thing they had ever seen. Not because it was threatening, because it was sincere. The humans had not come to gloat. They had not come to make a point. They had come because a man who had contributed to the deaths of their people had died, and they wanted him to know, even in death, that the names of the dead had followed him to the end. I am one of the remaining 3, Vorshan Kelix, former second consul to the Galactic Concord Council. I cast a vote that authorized the military strikes on 3 human colony worlds. 42,117 people died as a direct consequence of that vote. I have spent the last 11 years running from that fact. I have been thinking about Ambassador Yiltari. I learned, through a news report that somehow found its way to this remote station, that she has been working with the tribunal as an advisory member, not as a judge or a prosecutor. As an advisor, helping the tribunal understand the political and cultural context in which the strike decision was made. She did not take this role out of revenge or spite. She took it because she understood humans better than anyone in the galaxy, and she recognized something that took me 11 years to see. The tribunal is not a punishment. It is a mercy. Without the tribunal, the pursuit would have no endpoint. It would continue indefinitely. A permanent condition of being watched and tracked and followed, not by an angry mob, but by a calm, patient, endlessly methodical civilization that simply would not stop. The tribunal gives the pursuit a door to walk through, a way to end the pursuit, a mechanism by which the debt can be acknowledged, the accountability can be rendered, and the ledger can be closed. Yiltari fought for that door. She argued, in the early years of the tribunal's formation, that the judicial process must include a path to closure for both sides, not just the humans but also the people they were pursuing. She understood that without closure, the pursuit would become the punishment, and the punishment would have no limit. She saved us. The woman we ignored, the diplomat who warned us, and whom we dismissed as sentimental. She spent years of her life working to ensure that the people who had refused to listen to her would have a way out. I made a call last week, encrypted, routed through 7 relay points, to one of the other 2 remaining fugitives. His name is Torax, a former Drenhari fleet commander who led one of the 3 strike groups. He was not the admiral in overall command. He was a mid-level officer who followed orders. That distinction has not protected him. Torax has been running for 11 years. When I connected to his channel, the voice that answered was not the voice of the sharp, confident officer I remembered from council military briefings. It was hollow, thin, exhausted. He told me that he had not slept a full night in 6 years. He told me that he checked his perimeter sensors every 3 hours. He told me that he had moved 14 times, and that each time, within a few months, he would notice something: a human ship in a nearby port, a human name in a station directory, a human news broadcast where there had never been one before. And then he told me something that broke through the last wall I had built inside myself to keep the truth out. He said they found him 4 years ago. They had known where he was for 4 years. They were not coming for him. They were not sending an investigator. They were not dispatching a summons. They were just waiting. They had located him, confirmed his identity, and then simply maintained awareness. A human analyst somewhere had his location on a screen and updated it periodically and did nothing. They were waiting for him to come to them. The pursuit was no longer active. It had become ambient. It was no longer something that was happening to him. It was something that was around him, like gravity or atmosphere, a permanent feature of his environment that could not be escaped because it was not approaching from any particular direction. It was simply there. Torax asked me if I had received the tribunal invitation. I said yes. He asked if I had responded. I said no. There was a long silence. Then he said something that I have been turning over in my mind every hour since. He said he envied the ones who had already testified, not because their sentences were light. Some had received significant terms of confinement. He envied them because they were done. The pursuit was over for them. They had walked through the door, and on the other side, there was an ending. Whatever the consequence, there was finality. They could sleep. After the call ended, I sat in silence for a long time. Then I began this recording. I told myself it was for posterity. I told myself that someone needed to document what happened so that future civilizations would understand the cost of attacking humanity. Both of those things are true, but they are not the real reason I am making this recording. The real reason is that I am trying to find the courage to respond to the invitation. Let me tell you what I have learned in 11 years. I want to state it clearly, without embellishment, without self-pity, without the diplomatic hedging that defined my career and made me complicit in the deaths of 42,000 people. Every species in the galaxy understands retaliation. Retaliation is a fire. It burns hot. It burns fast. It consumes the fuel available to it, and then it burns out. The duration depends on the species, the severity of the provocation, and the resources available, but the fundamental dynamic is always the same. The heat fades. The energy dissipates. Eventually, the cost of sustained action exceeds the value of continued pursuit, and the fire dies. Every species I have ever studied follows this pattern. What humans do is not retaliation. It is obligation. They do not pursue you because they are angry. The anger was real. I do not doubt that. In the early months after the strikes, there was genuine fury in the human response. A hot, visceral, deeply felt rage at the murder of 42,000 of their people. But that rage faded years ago. What replaced it was not cold calculation. It was not strategic patience. It was something I do not have a word for in my own language. The closest I can come is this. Humans believe, with a conviction that operates below the level of conscious thought, that actions must have consequences. Not approximate consequences, not symbolic consequences, not institutional consequences applied to abstract entities like governments or military commands. Specific consequences for specific actions taken by specific individuals. They believe this the way they believe in gravity. It is not a philosophy. It is not a policy. It is a fundamental structural element of how they understand reality. I voted to authorize the deaths of 42,000 people. That is a specific action taken by a specific individual. The humans do not need to be angry at me to pursue me. They do not need to hate me. They need me to answer for what I did, the same way they need water to flow downhill. It is simply how the universe works, from their perspective. The ledger is unbalanced. It must be balanced, and they will wait as long as it takes. That is what I need whoever finds this recording to understand. Do not provoke humanity. Not because they have a powerful fleet, though they do. Not because they have sophisticated intelligence networks, though they do. Not because they are strategically brilliant, though they are. Do not provoke them because they will never stop. And the reason they will never stop is not because they choose not to. It is because they cannot. Pursuit is not a decision for them. It is a condition. It is built into the wiring of what they are, carried in their blood and their bones and their history, passed from generation to generation, like a genetic trait that cannot be bred out because it is not a flaw. It is a feature. It is the thing that made them survive on a world that tried to kill them every day for 100,000 years. And it is the thing that will make them follow you to the last star in the last galaxy at the end of time itself, if you give them a reason. I know there is a woman on Earth right now whose grandmother died on Ardennes Landing. Her name is in the files that were broadcast 11 years ago, though I do not know which name is hers. She has never held a weapon. She has never served in any military. She has never worked for any intelligence agency. She is, by every standard measure, an ordinary human being living an ordinary life. But she knows my name. She has known my name for 11 years. She knows I voted to authorize the strike that killed her grandmother. She knows I described the projected casualties as manageable. She knows I made a joke about her species 3 days before the vote. And she has not forgotten a single detail. If the tribunal fails, and the institutions dissolve, and the governments move on, and every official channel of accountability is closed, she will not move on. She will teach her children my name. Her children will teach their children. And 100 years from now, when I am long dead, and my species has moved on to other concerns, some descendant of that woman will find this recording and know that the man who called her great-great-grandmother's death manageable spent his final years hiding in a dead station at the edge of space, afraid to sleep. That is what it means to attack a human. You do not create an enemy. You create an inheritance, and it never expires. I am looking out the viewport of this station. The stars are cold and distant and silent. For 11 years, I found comfort in that silence. I told myself that the emptiness between the stars was a kind of protection, that the sheer vastness of space would swallow me up and make me invisible. I do not believe that anymore. The stars do not feel empty. They feel occupied. Somewhere out there, beyond the light of this dying sun, someone is sitting in a room with my name on a screen. They are not angry. They are not in a hurry. They are simply waiting, with a patience that makes the void itself feel small. I am going to open the tribunal invitation now. It has been sitting in my message queue for 3 years, unanswered. The final line says the invitation remains open indefinitely. Indefinitely. That word used to frighten me. Now I think I understand it differently. It is not a threat. It is a promise. The door will always be there. The humans will hold it open for as long as it takes, because closing it would mean giving up, and giving up is something they are constitutionally incapable of doing. I am going to type my response. I do not know if it will be enough. I do not know if anything can balance a ledger that has 42,000 names on one side and a single bureaucrat's apology on the other. But the humans are not asking me to balance it. They are asking me to show up, to stand in a room and say, yes, I did this, and to let the people I harmed see my face and hear my voice, and know that I know what I did. I think I owe them that. Not because they have pursued me for 11 years, not because I am tired of running, not because the alternative is spending the rest of my life staring at dead stars and checking my perimeter sensors every 3 hours. Because 42,000 people died, and I called it manageable, and I have never once said I was sorry. The cursor is blinking on my screen. The message field is empty. My hands are trembling. This is the hardest thing I have ever done. Harder than the vote, harder than the running, harder than the 11 years of silence and fear and loneliness. But I am going to do it, because the humans taught me something that I should have known all along. Actions have consequences, not eventually, not approximately, specifically and personally and permanently. I am pressing send now, and if you are hearing this, whoever you are, wherever you are, whenever you find this recording in whatever forgotten corner of space it ends up drifting through, remember this one thing above all else. Do not attack the humans. Not because they will destroy you, because they will remember you. And in the end, that is so much worse.